We're going to be setting up the maxillary denture against a full existing lower. We have articulated the model based on the bite goes into us. The thumb screw is in the back of the articulator, is locked in place to make sure we don't change our bite. And then we also have demarked with a Sharpie top of the pin to make sure we have a second point of reference in case our bites change for any reason or the thumb screw comes loose. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the pin away from our setup area. We have the base already be trimmed. The base is completely fitted onto our maxillary model. If the base is slightly loose, I recommend to flow some hot wax just in the back posterior area slightly on either side. This will ensure the plate stable on the model, and we'll clean this up later on when we get to the wax up stage. So once we have that established, then we're going to start with the anterior setup. The teeth's been given to you in class, and we're going to be using the Ivo Star Shade A203 molds for the anteriors, and subsequently the A2 D86 Nado Stars for the posteriors. So we're going to put the posteriors to the side. We're going to start with the anteriors. We are going to start with one quadrant, then move on to the second quadrant. We're going to start setting up with the anteriors first. Since we already have the midline established from our lower model, we've also demarked where the anterior is going to finish. We have established approximately 1 millimeter overjet and 1 millimeter overbite. So once we have that drawn on the model, then we can continue our setup. First thing we're going to do is we're going to grab a piece of wax and roll a piece of wax just to warm it up, to mold it so we can be able to have enough support for our teeth where we're going to put it. Just to have slightly enough wax that kind of gives us enough structure for the wax to be bonded or melted or luted onto the base. Just with the help of some font stock or any of your waxing instrument, you can establish that in place. Once done, we're going to take our teeth and we're going to put it in place. We want to make sure that we have enough wax to hold the tooth in place. We have established our overbite, and then we're going to go into the overjet, and from the side view, making sure we do have that 1 millimeter overjet, and making sure our long axes are straight up and down with sometimes a slight mesial tilt. Once we establish the tooth in place, then we can go ahead and heat up our instrument and lute this piece of wax around to make sure the tooth doesn't move once we have it in place. And you can see the mesial of our 2-1 is aligned with the midline, since when you put the other one on the side, the 1-1, it's going to be in place. Making sure we put enough wax to continue to keep the tooth in place. Again, you can see we establish our overjet and overbite, and with the long axis where we need it to be. While this piece of wax is cooling, we will start with another piece of wax so we can place the lateral. Again, just a piece of wax warmed up or softened to a point that you will be able to easily move it. Again, very gently place the other wax in here. And again, if the tooth moved while you're placing the second piece of wax, just go back. Since the wax is still soft, ensure your tooth, your central hasn't moved yet. If it moved, just bring it back into place prior to setting up the second and the laterals. Okay, as discussed in class, we are going to be setting the laterals just 0.5 of a millimeter shorter than the centrals. And again, because we don't have enough wax there, we're just going to have that. As you can see visually, the laterals are slightly shorter than the centrals, and we want to ensure that we follow the same arch. And we can see from this angle, our long axis is slightly mesially tilted. Once we have the centrals and the laterals in place, again, we want to ensure our overjet and overbites are met as per our requirement. Since this tooth is slightly more out, we are going with only 0.5 of an overjet in that case. Once you have established that, continue to lute your wax into place. It's easier to remove the articulator sometimes, and you'll have more working surface to make sure the teeth in place are completely secured. Now we're going to wait a few seconds. Soften the wax where the canine is going to go. You take the canine, and again, as discussed in class, the canine long axis is going to be straight up and down, perpendicular to our plane of occlusion, and the necks of the canine is going to be slightly positioned out. The incisal edge will fall in the same plane as our plane of occlusion, which is also the same height and same length as our centrals. Again, the way we're going to position our canine is the distal is going to be positioned towards the tuberosity, and with this long axis straight up and down. Let it cool down. And again, we will ensure that we still have our overjet and overbite. You can see from this incisally that the neck of the canine is protruded more out compared to the centrals and the lateral. Once we have the canine in place, we'll continue to secure it with the wax to ensure it doesn't move. Well, quadrant 1, or quadrant 2 in this case, is being cooled. We continue softening our wax so we can go ahead and start setting up our adjacent quadrant. Again, we're going to take some piece of wax, same concept, soften, and place it onto our base plate. In this case, since we established how much wax we need, I'm placing slightly more wax, so it'll be easier to set up all the 3 anteriors without going back and forth and putting wax. I'm going to make sure the wax is completely secured onto our base plate. And at this time, if you can go back and to check, make sure nothing has moved, and if it does move, you can go ahead, adjust it slightly, since the wax is still soft. we're going to set up the central in the same position that we set up our 2-1 with this at the same height, same length, and same long axis to give us a symmetrical look. You can check it from the incisal edge. Make sure the neck is the same height. And is as close to each other as possible. Now we can go ahead and set up the canine on this quadrant. Making sure the long axis is straight up and down, or as we call it, perpendicular to the plane of occlusion. And you can check for your symmetry right across. This lateral can be moved slightly forward. Now that we have all the 6 anteriors positioned in place, we'll go ahead and secure the wax to make sure once we start setting the posteriors, our anteriors are going to be secured in place without moving. Now we'll let this cool before we start the posteriors. Our anterior 6 set and cooled, and we know it's pretty solid, it's not moving, and we have established all the boundaries that we plan to keep in mind. That anteriors are the aesthetic zones, so once our plan was to get our aesthetic zone established, now we're going to move to setting up the posteriors. As you can see in the posterior region, we have a lot of room between our base and the lower model, so we're going to put a little bit extra wax to give us a slightly ease in setup. Just make sure your wax is nice and soft. Okay, I'm going to place the wax in the posterior region, and we will make sure, again, the same thing we did for the anteriors, that the wax we're going to put in place, it's completely bonded or secured in place onto our base plate. We can get that done through melting the wax in place to ensure this wax is stable and will stay in place. And now we're going to start with our posterior setup. Nanostar A2 mold D86. We're going to start with our 4s. Keep in mind not to mix one quadrant with the other quadrant, so always keep the tooth in place. If you're not using, put it back in place onto the card. This way you will avoid mixing up right with the left. Add slightly more wax. The long axis of the posterior, we're going to keep it perpendicular to our plane of occlusion, and the lingual cusp will fall in the fossa of the lower. Since we're setting up against a already existing dentition, we will try to get the best maximum intercuspation possible, but yet continue to maintain our incisal edges, and in this particular case our buccal cusps are in place and they are forming. The neck will fall slightly more in, and we will make sure our lingual cusps are in place. As we can see here, long axis straight up and down, and the lingual cusps are touching. In this particular case, again, we are going to make sure we get the best occlusion possible. Majority of the time, we don't get the exact same sizing of the tooth or the teeth when we pick for a particular case. We pick the best possible size. In this particular case, we have picked D86, which will occlude better, but as you can see, the uppers are slightly smaller, but again, this is something that we are making a compromise for. But once we get into setup of upper against a complete lower, we have to make those changes. But in terms of setting up upper and lowers for your next project, are the teeth we're going to be picking in terms of the occlusion, there will be a cusp to fossa, and we will continue to do that whenever possible to get the best occlusion. Once 4 is set up, we will move on to this 5. Okay. We will make sure the long axis is perpendicular and this 4 and the 5s are set in a parallel to each other. So if you were to draw a line right against from the long axis, we want to make sure they're parallel to each other. And again, we want to make sure the marginal ridges are in place. If you have any wax residues on the occlusal surfaces, it's a good idea to make sure you clean them so this will not affect your occlusion. Once the 4 is secured in place, we will move to 6 and then subsequently to 7 with the same concept of occlusion in mind. Always check from the posterior to make sure the lingual cusps are in place, are in the occlusion. And once you have all the lingual cusps into the fossas, you will form a buccal overjet, or we also call it, we have our buccal overjet, and from this corner, which will ensure the patient doesn't have any cheek bite. Basically, cheek bite happens when the buccal cusps of the posteriors are set up too close to the lower, and edge-to-edge orientation. Once the 7 is set up, and we're going to make sure everything is secured in place. And at any given time, you can always go back and kind of check your interiors and also check the posteriors to make sure everything's in place. And if anything moved, you can always go back, just heat up your wax and just slightly make just minor adjustments prior to the waxing up stage. As you can see, we have a nice buccal corridor forming. We have a nice shape of our interiors. Posterior slightly smaller for this particular case, but again, we've decided to go with the D86. Could have gone with slightly bigger to kind of give us a better occlusion. But again, the challenge when it comes to setting up against the already existing lower is to kind of best guesstimate the size that we use. So once we have one side done, again, secure the wax in place from buccal and from lingual, and let it cool prior to us moving into the next stage. And the next stage is to set up the other quadrant. And we're going to warm up some wax to set up quad 1. Just make sure your wax is nice and soft. There are different techniques of setups, and different technicians have different setup methodologies that they will continue mastering that. And once you start setting up in one particular way, and as you move on to your different semesters here at George Brown, you will have different methods of setting up, waxing up, and we want to make sure to capture all the different styles of setup. But at the end, it doesn't matter which style or which technique you used when you're setting up. The final goal is to make sure the final denture or the final prosthesis in any particular case is functional. And in this case, we want to make sure by the time we finish this particular case, our maxillary denture is going to be in maximum intercuspation with our existing lower. So once we have the wax nice and soft, we can start setting up the quadrant 1. And again, we're going to do the same thing that we did with quadrant 2 in that case. And it's always good to keep the neck of the teeth clean. When you have it nice, whenever you set up a tooth in place, try to keep the necks clean from the wax residue. It's a lot easier to visualize the long axis when there are no wax covering any of the facial surfaces. Our pen came off, so we can just leave it on the side. See, we have established our contact with a posing. Whenever you're setting up, it's always advisable to check from every angle, every corner, to make sure like all the areas that we have discussed in class, such as costofossa, your long axes, your plane of occlusion, marginal ridge, they're all line up as instructed. And again, just make sure always to keep the occlusal surfaces of your teeth clean. This way you're not going to have any interference of wax with the opposing model. And vice versa, just always make sure your opposing model is free of wax, that any added wax will alter the occlusion. As we move forward to set up the 6, same concept again, heat up the wax to soften it. When the wax is soft, it's a lot easier to move the teeth around. Like I can do any orientation I need when the wax is nice and soft. And this way it gives me a better occlusion, and it eases the setup when you don't have the wax cooled, which that means you have to start heating it up. So when the wax is nice and soft, move it in place, and now you can secure it in place. Always wait a few extra seconds whenever you are setting up the next tooth. So this will give the wax some time to cool prior to putting on or placing the next tooth on the arch. So this way the first tooth, in this particular case, if you do that, then the 6th is not going to move significantly. Now we are finished with our maxillary setup, just making sure all the marginal ridges fall in place, and then we're still maintaining our anterior aesthetic. Everything has moved. And I noticed this canine had slightly, the neck has slightly moved, protruded inwards, so we can just push it slightly out. Our wax is soft, and establish that. And now just make sure all the wax are secured in place. Once all the wax in every tooth is secured, this will ensure the wax will keep the tooth in position that we have established without anything moving. As we discussed in class, whenever you're setting up for any setup assignment, it's advisable to use as least amount of wax as possible to ensure least amount of shrinkage. We discussed shrinkage happens within a percentage, and the higher the percentage of the wax, and the higher degree of shrinkage. As discussed also, that you just need enough wax to keep the tooth or teeth secured onto the arch. And now we just want to make sure everything is nice and blended in prior to we do our wax up. Okay, and you can always keep your models clean, making sure there's no extra wax, and also just clean the surface of the teeth prior to the wax up stage. It will help you a lot, and we have less mess for the next stage. You always have your little toothbrush handy. It always comes handy in terms of cleaning up the wax. Just notice here the tooth is slightly outwards. Just want to make sure everything is nice and clean. And this does it, our setup assignment. Next thing we're going to do is our wax up. Stay tuned for the wax up video. Thank you.